Right now, I'm seeing that the Iranians are not going to be sending a delegation. There are no plans for new talks because of the US seizing the cargo ship. How big a deal is it that the Americans did seize that cargo ship? What does this mean if the Iranians are continually going to put off or deny joining talks because of what the Americans are doing? Who has to change their tact if they do want to see the talks re-engage?
So I think something is going to have to be done here, whether perhaps it is the Iranians doing something retaliatory so that they feel that they're even, or if Trump were to release the cargo ship or allow it to go through, the Iranians will not stand for the humiliation. And they're also capable of doing the same to Trump.
This is The Global Gambit.
Welcome back, everyone, to The Global Gambit. This is a podcast that looks at geopolitics, economics, international relations, and right now, the reoccurring developments in Iran around the peace talks or not. Well, I don't know really what's going on. What I do know is that there was a revolutionary piece in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend, which demonstrated just how much of a plan there wasn't on the side of the United States government, and specifically Trump absolutely losing his mind. And well, let's put it this way. I've currently been in New York for the past few days, and I've been learning a lot from inside perspective of previous American administrating advisors and so on. And even if you do plan to go to war, this isn't how you do it. Conversely, we've seen some interesting developments about how much the Iranians or IOGC specifically have been learning from Ukraine and trying to modernize, adapt, and prepare themselves for any events such as what we've been seeing in the past 8 weeks. But there's a lot more to discuss here, and I'm delighted to be rejoined by Trita Parsi, who is the co-founder and executive vice president of Quincy Institute. Trita, always a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, I mean, normally I just sort of dive in with a good question, but I really don't know where to go with this. What would you say has been the core? What have been the core developments for you in the past few days? Okay, we've had the circle jerking of peace talks attempts, but otherwise, it just seems like the Strait of Hormuz is open, it's closed. Take me through what's actually happening.
So as you and I are talking, it's not entirely clear yet whether the Iranians will show up in Islamabad or not. Trump is, of course, speaking up. The prospects coming out now and saying that there's going to be a deal signed today in Islamabad remains to be seen. Trump's strategy has been to exaggerate progress, push down oil prices, but also I think it's partly done in order to pave the way for the blame game if things go bad, or even if he himself is actually planning to walk out of this and not sign a deal, for him to say, well, we actually had a deal, but the Iranians messed it up, and then point to all of these different things as part of that narrative to say that he's not at fault. But I think a critical thing that has changed, or not changed, but has really become really problematic in the last couple of days is Trump's lack of discipline and inability to resist the urge to declare himself a winner every time the Iranians actually take a de-escalatory move or show some restraint. When the Iranians come out and say, and I think it was a deliberately vague tweet, but perhaps it was too vague, that the strait is open. When you read that more carefully, you saw that actually not a lot had changed. They still said that this would have to be in coordination with the Iranian government, which means that they're still in control. They left it unsaid whether they will be charging tolls or not. I spoke to people on the Iranian side. It actually turns out that it was quite unclear to them as well. But it was supposed to be a de-escalatory move that Trump should have reciprocated. Instead, he immediately goes out, declares victory, humiliates the Iranians, claims that his coercive strategy has worked. And this then begets a very strong reaction from the Iranian side, in which they go out and say that the strait is now closed again. And then we saw how Trump also then escalated with the going after a tanker or a cargo ship that belongs to the Iranians. And we've seen this in the past. We saw it a couple of weeks into the war, in which the Iranians and some of the regional states had actually negotiated a pathway for de-escalation. Iran would have stopped hitting some of those GCC states if they had done a couple of things in return. It started off with the Iranians signaling that this would happen, and then the GCC was going to reciprocate a couple of hours later. In between, Trump issues a tweet, humiliates the Iranians, declares victory, says that they're backing off because of his threats and because of all of the bombings he's done. In addition to that, they even escalate by bombing a desalination plant on the island of Qeshm. and the whole opening is ruined. And then we've seen what happened between the GCC and Iran. So we've seen this in the past. He tends to prioritize the optics of victory over the reality of actually getting a deal. And it's a trait that he has in almost all settings. He does it vis-a-vis the Europeans, vis-a-vis the Russians. He's done it vis-a-vis the North Koreans. The difference is we're now in an active war. And in an active war, perhaps you have to show a little bit more discipline to actually get across the finishing line of a negotiation, rather compared to what you need to do when you're doing grandstanding vis-a-vis the Europeans on Greenland, for instance.
I'm just absolutely bowled over by the extent to which this guy seems to be. Well, it's almost like a caricature to me, Trita, because it's so much driven by impulsivity, reactions to things that he doesn't like. I can think of any kind of soap opera or reality TV program where someone is literally just sort of getting angry because he saw something that he didn't like, and therefore he's going to react and not sort of double check what he said. And in the heat of the moment, it's absolutely crazy in my mind. And what clearly I think has been a few potential opportunities to solidify proper set of expectations, a good framework, seems to have been thrown up in the air because of these moments of outrage or reaction, recklessness, and so on. So from the IRGC perspective, from the Iranian perspective, like, what is their game plan here? Just allow Trump to continue to self-sabotage or try to leverage it even further?
No, I think at this point, the Iranians, on the one hand, we have to recognize that there's a specific dynamic that has now come into play that actually makes it easier for Trump to just walk away from these talks than it does for the Iranians. And the reason is the key thing the Iranians want and need is sanctions relief. They will only get that through a deal. A control of the Strait of Hormuz, they will continue to have a deal or no deal, but that's not sufficient to make up for the losses that they have suffered because of the sanctions that are in place. They're in dire need of investment to rebuild the country. Revenue from the Strait of Hormuz is not going to cover that. And even if they manage to reestablish economic relations with a lot of different countries through the control of the Strait, that's not the same thing as actually getting investment. So they need sanctions relief. And imagine if right now you end up having essentially a new status quo in which most of the conflicts between the US and Iran have been pacified, but there is no sanctions relief. What are the Iranians, what's the leverage they have left to actually get the sanctions lifted? This is their moment to get it lifted. So they are in dire need of that. And I think this has given the Trump administration a sense that they are, at least in this specific phase of it, in a stronger position vis-a-vis the Iranians, because Trump has already gotten what he wants. He got out of the war. And if there is no deal and he doesn't go back into bombing Iran, it will be very difficult for the Iranians to restart bombing the GCC states or US bases, etc. Because at that moment, they will look as if they are the aggressors. And that's going to have repercussions internationally, including with Russia and China.
Even despite Trump's misdemeanors and self-destructive rhetoric, he still has the absolute leverage because of the control over the Iranian economy and whether or not it can stabilize and reconstruct itself effectively.
He certainly has leverage that he can use, but at the same time, from his standpoint, if he goes with a deal, the deal would have to entail sanctions relief. It would be good for the United States because he would be able to say that he got a deal better than Obama's on the nuclear issue, for instance. And it would be good for the United States to finally be able to say, okay, this conflict with Iran has now been either resolved or some sort of a semi-solution has been achieved through negotiations. But he will then also face another problem if he goes with a deal, which is the Israelis are mad enough about the fact that the US has stopped bombing Iran. But it's a completely different thing if Trump then also strikes a deal with Iran and lifts sanctions. The Israelis have opposed every deal that the US has contemplated with Iran that entailed sanctions relief. Part of the reason for that is, of course, that what war achieved for the Israelis was to set back Iran several decades, bomb them back to the Stone Age, as they said, destroy their industrial base. That is achieved through warfare, but it is also achieved over a longer period of time through sanctions that slowly but surely degrades the country's industrial base. Iranian oil fields are not producing as much oil as they could because they have been deprived of the investment and new technology that is needed to keep those oil fields up to par. So over time, it is degrading Iran. But if the United States then lifts the sanctions and on top of that strikes a deal with Iran and no longer is at war, Iran would essentially be unleashed. This is the nightmare scenario for the Israelis. So their resistance against the deal is going to be massive. And the question is, will Trump take that fight with the Israelis, or will he say, you know what, I got out of the war. It's just easier for me to walk away. I won't go back into the war, but I also won't make a deal and lift sanctions. And that way I avoid that bigger fight with the Israelis. And this is just politically easier for me to do. So he can go in that direction. It will not be an ideal situation for him, but he will still have achieved his main objective, get out of the war, whereas the Iranians will have been deprived of their main goal, which is to get the sanctions lifted.
Now, obviously, what looms over much of this is the JCPOA. The previous Obama deal has been referenced a lot because those heavily critical of Trump essentially emphasized that he's going to come up with something very similar to that, if not even worse, or watered down, at least from a US perspective and its interests over enrichment and the Iranians' interests on that. So, what's your position on that? Is this effectively where we're going? A sort of a new deal of that kind, or is it going to be different?
I think it's going to be different. What was on the table in Geneva was very different in the sense that the Iranians would only be enriching for 2 reactors on a needs basis, which meant that for the next 5 to 7 years, they wouldn't be enriching at all. They would not be keeping any stockpile of enriched uranium on their own soil. Those are significant differences. That would objectively make it a better deal from a US perspective than the JCPOA. So Trump already back then could have objectively said he got a better deal than Obama. He could have declared victory. Instead, he chose to declare war. And now that has backfired tremendously. What is fascinating is that in these negotiations that are taking place, the Iranians have actually not backtracked on the Geneva proposal. What I think they're doing instead, however, is that they're asking for a much higher price in terms of the sanctions relief that they're asking for in return. In fact, I think they're going for the whole gambit. Whereas the sanctions they were asking for in Geneva was far more limited in return. So the price, the deal is still on the table, the offer is still there, but the price has just gone up.
Okay, wow, that's quite interesting. So then, as part of the subsequent rounds of talks, what I thought interesting was Trump pulled J.D. Vance off it yesterday, and now it's being led by the typical dynamic duo of Kushner and Witkoff, the experts of creating peace deals across the world. It's like sarcasm there, audience. But I don't know. What do you expect from these latest rounds of talks then, Trita?
It seems like J.D. Vance is back on the team again. And to be frank with you, yeah. If it had only been Kushner and Witkoff, I'm pretty sure the Iranians would absolutely not have shown up any longer. So Vance is still in it. And this round is going to be more important than the last round because this is right before the deadline. They will either strike a deal, they will walk away, or they will delay it or extend the deadline a couple of more days or whatever. One of those 3 things are going to happen, and none of them can happen without J.D. Vance being there.
Why does J.D. Vance have such influence?
It's not that he has an influence. It's the fact that the Iranians refused to negotiate with Kushner and Witkoff, who have now completely lost credibility in their eyes because of what happened in Geneva. And for Witkoff, it was the second time in which, in the midst of negotiations, the United States and Israel bombed Iran.
So we've sort of reached a level of intensity right now. It's largely around the Strait of Hormuz. We've had the progress with Lebanon and Israel. So before coming to the Strait of Hormuz, which is the main centerpiece or flashpoint, take me through how the developments in the Levant influence the IRGC or Iran's decision-making here, strategic decision-making.
So the Iranian narrative, and it seems to have become validated by others, is that the ceasefire in Lebanon, to the extent that it exists, only came into being because of pressure from the Iranians, in which they said that they would walk away from their own deal with the US unless the Israelis stop bombing Lebanon. And we saw then that Trump issued that tweet, I think the strongest thing I've ever seen from a US president, saying Israel is not permitted to bomb Lebanon. And there's been some low-level fighting going on between Lebanon and Hezbollah since, but this massive bombardment of Beirut has ended. And the Iranians didn't do this just for charity for the Lebanese. I mean, I think there's three key reasons why they did this. One is there was a narrative being created that Iran had abandoned Lebanon back in 2024. And I think the Iranians were very sensitive about this, and they wanted to make sure that nothing was done that reinforced that type of a narrative. Secondly, they also recognize that if warfare continues in Lebanon, then the risk of spillover onto Iran is significant, as it already has spilled over twice. And since they're trying to get a durable end to the war, it means that you also need to pacify these other theaters. But the most important factor, I think, is this was a test for Trump. The Iranians wanted to see, can you control Israel? Can you rein in Israel? Because if the United States cannot rein in Israel, or doesn't want to rein in Israel, or chooses not to rein in Israel, and Israel is free to restart wars, drag the US into those wars, then what's the point of a deal with the United States? Then you might as well make the deal with whoever is actually making the decision, which seems to be someone who's not in Washington, D.C. So the tweet, all of that, I think, was important measures by Trump to show that he can control the Israelis, because from the Iranian side, there's not much of a value to make a deal with Trump if he's not the ultimate decision maker.
So does this finally put to bed who controls who? Because obviously a lot of people claim that the Israelis control America, or Bibi Netanyahu was personally the one who persuaded Trump into undertaking this whole set of operations in the past 2 months? Or is it that America ultimately, when push comes to shove, will call the shots and rein in Israel when it feels it really has to, which seems to have reached a new threshold?
Well, I think both of those narratives at times are a little bit too simplistic. Israel has a tremendous amount of influence in Washington, D.C. And for any president to oppose Israel carries a tremendous amount of political cost. And then the question is, when is it worth paying that cost? In most of the scenarios we've seen so far, even though it should have, it appears that it didn't. So it should have been worth the cost for Biden to put an end to the genocide in Gaza out of pure self-preservation, because he lost the election, or Kamala Harris did, to a very large extent because of Biden's policy on Gaza. He never seemed to have fully realized that or accepted that, even though a lot of people in his surroundings constantly saw it. But he chose not to. Now, was it because he was just so blindly in support of Israel that he did it, or was it because he didn't want to pay the cost for having that? We don't know the answer to that. But once the cost is too high to not oppose Israel, then we have seen that American presidents on numerous occasions have said no to Israel. Obama did by striking the JCPOA. Reagan did by putting pressure on the Israelis in 1982 to get out of Lebanon. And we've seen that Trump on a few occasions have done it as well with Israel. This one was the last example of it. The challenge we've seen with Trump, though, is that he has the ability of saying no to the Israelis and do so rather forcefully, rather publicly, rather embarrassingly for the Israelis. But then slowly but surely, he backtracks and he does not sustain the pressure. And for this deal with the Iranians to work, it necessitates massive pressure on the Israelis, a high cost for Trump in opposing the pro-Israeli interest in Washington and many of his own donors, and the cost of sustaining that pressure. Otherwise, this whole deal can collapse.
No, I guess I'm just curious how much that this could reignite. Could the Lebanon front ignite again if the Israelis find a way to sort of emphasize that because of Iran's dealings with Hezbollah, or the systemic threat that Hezbollah faces, that it's still within the interests of the United States to support their actions in their near abroad? And there's obviously a lot of concern around the Israelis effectively absorbing southern Lebanon. They're just going to occupy it up until the river and then not really relinquish it back, which is how things have escalated in the past several decades. So I'm just wondering, in your opinion, how far that could go, and therefore how that could trickle down to the US-Iranian dynamics.
No, I think it's a very fair point. And what you're pointing to is that even if a deal is struck, Even if the Israelis back off temporarily, they will continuously try to find way to sabotage the deal, to reignite the war, whether it is because of Lebanon or because of another reason. There will be no shortage of creativity there. And in the meantime, they themselves will probably intensify the dirty war, the one in which they will have some degree of plausible deniability, assassinations in Iran, sabotage in Iran. A lot of these other things will probably intensify, not just continue in a scenario in which overt war is taken off the table. So this is in no way, shape, or form an end to the Israeli-Iranian rivalry or enmity just because the US pulls out. It's just going to take a different shape, and the Israelis are going to try various ways to find new opportunities in which they can bring the US back into this war, into that conflict. Whether they'll succeed or not is, of course, a completely different thing. Because if there actually is a viable and beneficial deal between the United States and Iran that the US finds to be very useful for it, then it will be much more difficult for the Israelis to get the United States to not just join in the war, but also scuttle this other beneficial deal that they have now. Of course, we have one major example in which the Israelis succeeded in doing that, and that was the JCPOA, in which they managed to convince Trump to walk out of the JCPOA. Netanyahu is on record bragging about him being the key factor as to why Trump pulled out. Now, at the time, perhaps the president didn't think that this would lead to war, but nevertheless, now we know the cost of it. And it's going to be very difficult, in my view, to see future American presidents willing to risk another war of this kind in order to appease the Israelis.
So let's bring it in the final section to obviously the Strait and how this all bleeds into that. Right now, I'm seeing that the Iranians are not going to be sending a delegation. There are no plans for new talks because of the US seizing the cargo ship. So as sort of a two-pronged question. Firstly, how big a deal is it that the Americans did seize that cargo ship? And second, what does this mean if the Iranians are continually going to put off or deny joining talks because of what the Americans are doing? Who has to change their tact if they do want to see the talks re-engage?
Well, what Trump tried to do with taking that cargo ship was to assert that he is in a position of coercing the other side. He was essentially trying to humiliate the Iranians publicly. And it may be a strategy that works in some other settings. It may be a strategy that has worked in some of his other negotiations with other countries. It is not a strategy that is likely to work with Iranians, particularly when the Iranians believe that they actually came out strategically stronger out of this war and that the United States is not likely to go back into it. So I think something is going to have to be done here, whether perhaps it is the Iranians doing something retaliatory so that they feel that they're even, or if Trump were to release the cargo ship or allow it to go through. Well, I think at this point the engines are destroyed. But bottom line, something's going to have to be done, because I find it very difficult that the Iranians will show up at the table without some sort of a measure that seeks to erase the last 48 or so hours. And again, look, both sides need to have a winning narrative to claim that they enjoyed these negotiations and came out of these negotiations as winners. But there's a very fine balance you have to strike when you claim yourself a winner without humiliating the other side. And Trump loves the humiliation. The Iranians will not stand for the humiliation, and they're also capable of doing the same to Trump. So I think they have to understand they both either manage to get a narrative that is putting forward some sort of a success for themselves that doesn't humiliate the other side, or they're both going to have to end up having no deal and face the consequences of that.
So it's largely not even about military strategy, operational thinking. It's just about the egos, or specifically the ego of one guy, and how much the recipient party, the other side, is willing to sort of play the game based on his style. Would you say?
Unfortunately, yes. And I think, again, if we take a look at how Trump has operated throughout this presidency and the previous one, he really enjoys conducting himself in this kind, completely unrestrained on social media, humiliating the other side. And we've seen a lot of countries that essentially swallowed their pride, had to go along with it, focus on what's real and set aside the optics. Because a lot of it is just optics, particularly when he's losing in the negotiation. it becomes even more important for him to humiliate the other side publicly, to give the impression, the optics of as if he's actually winning. The difference is, in those other settings when this was done, the United States was not in a state of war, but now it is. And that makes it so much more dangerous and risky for him to behave in the manner that he does.
So what lessons does this teach us about the extent to which we have a commander-in-chief behaving as he does, but also in a wartime setting versus being in a more peacetime setting?
This is the fear that a lot of folks have had, which is that at the end of the day, if a really bad crisis emerges in which he is really on the losing end of things, that this type of imbalance, this type of even if it is designed to look as if he's a madman, at this point, most people are actually convinced that he is mad, not just putting on an act. They see him as imbalanced, but not in the manner that he wants them to, in a manner that I think is going to really backfire on the United States. I mean, going out there and threatening to destroy an entire civilization, which fueled speculation that he was actually seriously considering nuclear weapons. What does that do to every other state that believes that their security is dependent on that of the United States, that are depending on the US as a protector? To see that this is the type of a conduct that the president of the United States does. I mean, that's going to be very fascinating to see what the GCC states are going to do coming out of this war. They're not going to abandon the United States. They can afford to, but I would suspect that there's going to be some significant diversification away from the United States and a lot of investments in a lot of other countries, including China, which from the standpoint of most American foreign policy experts would be a very significant strategic setback for the US.
Yeah, I had one final question, but if I can be cheeky enough to ask you a penultimate other one, which is simply that there's been a lot of emphasis on this being part of a grand strategic plan to take on China, right? You decouple its core provisions, Venezuela, Iran, you weaken Russia as well. This whole sort of dismantling of the systematically of the system around China. Can we put that notion to bed now? Because I think it's absurd. We clearly Trump this, more than a day ahead, but people claiming it's all about China.
Absolutely. I think there's been a lot of sane washing going on in which people are trying to find a deep geostrategic calculation behind everything that is happening. And I think it's quite clear at this point there isn't. For most of the things that he does, it's very impulsive. It's not well thought through. It's not well planned, and it doesn't fit into a larger strategic strategy. I mean, look at what the national security strategy said that came out in December. It was all about focusing on the hemisphere. The Middle East was the strongest language yet about leaving the Middle East. And here we are, the United States, almost going into a land war in the Middle East again. I mean, it's absurd. That NSS didn't even have the value of a Post-it note at the end of the day. So I think we have to understand that this is a president that makes decisions on his own, based on his impulses, and all of these other justifications and strategy documents, etc., are nice things, but they're not necessarily reliable. They're not necessarily reflective of what he's ultimately going to do. It doesn't mean that it's not reflective of some of the strategists in the administration. But these strategists who wrote that document, who were planning to go along with that strategy, at the end of the day, have to recognize that the president probably never read that document. And as a result, he makes his decisions based on his impulses. The Israelis were very successful to just talking to him directly and bypassing the entire American policy process, one that is already quite dysfunctional, but nevertheless, they managed to bypass it. And as a result, get him to make decisions that completely contradict the strategies that had been formulated by his own people.
Absolute insanity. But Trita, I guess the last question is simply, where does this go from here? Are we going to see talks? Are we going to see escalation in the Strait of Hormuz? Are we just going to go back to what we saw in much of March? Or are we at this level of intensity of escalation and we're not going to go up or down the ladder?
I stick with what I said about a week and a half ago. I put it at about 25% chance of a deal, 5% for a full scale going back into war, and 70% that there will be a walkout, essentially no deal, but a new status quo, a non-negotiated status quo, in which Iran continues to control the strait, but the US walks out of this war. The instability in that situation is primarily going to be because of the US, in that scenario, likely trying to keep that naval blockade in place somewhat. It's still porous, but if they intensify it, then that's going to be a trigger for a major re-escalation, and then we can be back in full-scale war.
But doesn't that effectively mean that we're in a state of like North Korea? We never see a ceasefire established, we never see an armistice, and we're just in a perpetual state of conflict.
If we have that walkout scenario, then that certainly is going to be the case. If there is a deal, of course, it's a different story.
Okay, well, let's hope for that. But Trita Parsi, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks very much for watching, everyone. Be sure to like the video and, of course, most of all, subscribe so you never miss the latest updates and deepest insider dives in the upcoming videos. We've got guests like General Wesley Clark, former Supreme Commander of NATO. We've got a Senator, Mark Kelly, and we've got some fantastic experts from across the spectrum on Iran, on Ukraine, and many more coming up. So lots to look forward to. I'll see you all there. Take care.